All right, so for bucktail, today we're going to be talking about bucktail and where to cut material from, vice versa. And we have a variety of different tails here. We'll be taking a look at the quality of the tails and, for instance, how different tails can have hair in different places that you'll want to use. But the main topic will be essentially when it comes to where to choose the hair on the tail for what sort of flies you're tying. So for instance, if we start talking about hair on the tail, so there's times where, for instance, the hair could be either stiffer or softer up top, right? And that'll be depending on tails. And then there are times where the hair is stiffer down at the bottom. Now, for instance, this tail, it's pretty stiff up top. If we look, the hair is pretty stiff up there. The tail in general, there's not a lot of soft hair in this, but the hair does seem to be a little softer down low. And you can kind of just feel it in terms of how springy the material is when you're messing with it. So it's something to pay attention to. And again, the hair will react differently from depending on where you cut it from. And each tail is different. A lot of times the softer hair will be up top, and then the stiffer hair will be down low. We can see this one, the hair is pretty stiff down low, and then it's softer up here. So for instance, down here, we could see the hair is very stiff in terms of how it reacts. But up top over here, this hair is softer. And you could just feel it in terms of how the material is. So a lot of times it'll be better, for instance, to use the softer hair for something like hollow flies, or potentially even if we're trying to tie particular bait fish flies where we don't want the material to flare outwards. So, and then there's times where having stiffer hairs a good thing, because something like a bulkhead, for instance, we want the hair to flare out, almost like spin in a certain way. So that's when using some of this stiffer hair really comes into play, is when you're tying something like a bulkhead, for instance. And again, it's going to be different for each tail. Sometimes the hair, like I said, this hair is stiffer up top, and this one has some softer hair up top. So each tail is going to be different. You're going to have to figure that out looking with the tails. And these are just random tails that we got. Now, if we take, for instance, this one's a pretty long one. Let's check this one out. Caveman ripped that open. This one's actually not too bad. Yeah, so this hair is extremely stiff down here. This stuff right here is very stiff. This is the sort of stuff that I would use for like Bob's Banners, flies that aren't as important, for instance. I'll use something like that in the material where we still need to build up some bulk. And then here's something, this hair right here is the sort of hair that I would be using for not hollow flies. Again, it's very rare we'll find a tail where we can actually get hollow fly material, really good ones. That's why it's important to buy nice tails. But this hair, for instance, up top over here, this stuff's pretty good. We can use this for bucktail deceivers. We can use this for flatwing throats, all sorts of stuff like that. Just building up the body of flies. Again, it's still fairly stiff, but this is kind of middle of the road to where it's not too stiff and not too soft, so you can kind of do your general all-around fly tying. I use this sort of stuff for like deceivers, stuff like that. So this one's just kind of a tail. This is almost all stiff. Some of this stuff you can use up here, but I mean, this tail is pretty stiff. This is the sort of tail I would use. It's also kind of dirty as well. This is the sort of tail I would use for pretty much like poppers, things like that. Pretty low quality tail. All right, when it comes to the tail here, this is the first tail that we were looking at. Now, most of the stiffer hair is near the bottom section, but I'd say probably the upper 2/3 are relatively similar. But I'm going to show you here, I'm going to try and find what I think is like the softest hair, and we're going to cut that and tie it on and see how it reacts. So you can see here, I'm applying some pretty stiff pressure to the material, and it flares out slightly, but it's still pretty manageable. And you can see once I apply some more tension here, and again, I'm applying some pretty stiff tension with my thread, it's not flaring out. So this sort of thread really works. So this sort of bucktail is what I generally use for all of my general fly tying, whether it's deceiver throats, whether it's tying flat wings, things like that. This is just good all around bucktail, decent quality, nothing crazy. So now what I'm going to do is let's go to the bottom section of the tail here, and you can see the bottom section, the hair is much stiffer. Immediately right off the bat, you can see the hair flaring wildly. And this is due to the fact that stiffer material, when you apply tension to it, it flares much more than the softer material. It has to do probably with the core of the bucktail and how hollow it is and vice versa. But the main takeaway here is that with the stiffer material, it's going to be much harder to control. It's going to flare out a lot more. So you can see here, just by applying thread and using the same amount of tension I did on the previous piece of bucktail, the bucktail is flaring out much more. The stiffer bucktail like this you can still use, and a lot of times it's really good for stuff like bulkheads. Also, I love using it for poppers and things like that. And you can see the difference here between the two. The first tie had much softer bucktail, much more manageable than the stiffer bucktail. This next tail, I wanted to show you, we're going to do 3 types of hollow ties. Now, the results are going to be somewhat similar in appearance, but you'll see how the material will slightly change. Now, in the top right corner, this material is pretty much the softest material. Unfortunately, it's also the shortest. But what we're going to do is we're going to take some of this, essentially the softest bucktail that I could find on the tail, and we're going to do a hollow tie. So you can see it doesn't flare that much, and the whole idea behind having nice, soft bucktail, especially with hollow tying, is that it's much more easy to control when managing it and controlling the flare. You still want some stiffness in the material because it's going to be under pressure. I mean, even the softest of bucktail will always flare out, but it's much easier to work with, and you're going to be able to get the results that you're looking for with softer bucktail. So even though this isn't what I would call necessarily even hollow quality bucktail, the softest section on the tail that I used here, we got a pretty nice hollow tie. Again, the shortest material, generally I like a longer hair for hollow ties, but you get the idea. So now moving, this is somewhere in between. This is like, the material is getting stiffer now, but it is still manageable. But what you're going to see here is it's going to slightly flare out a little bit more when we apply some tension here. So you can see how the hair is just flaring out a little bit more than that softer section. But folding it back and wrapping our thread jam in front, we're going to get pretty similar results. You can see here, once I let go there, this hair has much more tension to it than the previous tie. It's flaring out a lot more. So I'm going to probably need to build up a little bit more of a thread dam to try and control this tie, for instance. But we still get a pretty nice result overall, and you can still tie decent hollow flies. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the absolute stiffest section. Now this is the sort of material you're going to be tying bulkheads with. We're getting in the area to where it's getting somewhat close to deer belly at times with how stiff it is and how much it flares out. You can see here it's flaring out wildly. Again, this is great for bulkheads, for popper tails, stuff like that. But I did want to show you that you can still tie hollow flies even with less desirable bucktail. May require a little bit more work in terms of thread dams and getting it working the way you want it, but you can still do it. It is much harder to manage, and you can see the one thing is with the stiff bucktail, look at how it's flaring out right here, is that it's not going to taper as nicely, especially after like wetting it and drying it. But on the plus side is you're going to be pushing a lot of water. So, the movement of the bucktail, because it's under so much tension, it's going to have a certain effect in the water. So I thought this was interesting. It's much more apparent on the very stiff bucktail in the front section of the hook here. It's much more apparent on the front section here as opposed to the rear two ties, but I thought it was worth noting. All right, well, this was our first video on bucktails. I have many more videos to make on this subject. Bucktail is one of the most common materials in saltwater fly tying. I'd probably say it makes up about 60 to 70% of the material that I use on a daily basis, it seems like. It's important to understand how to tie with bucktail in the most efficient way possible. So that's the whole point of this video series. So hopefully you enjoyed. If you have any questions or you have any ideas or any topics that you'd like to see covered, feel free to leave a comment down below. My name is Mike from LI Flies Mike. Thank you again for watching. We have fly fishing and fly tying videos that come out weekly. We have live fly tying on Friday nights and early access for members. Well, thank you so much for watching. Have a great season out there this year. And tight lines.